Why did you come back to Seoul?
Kyle grabbed her wrist before she reached the stairwell. He dragged her back. "Where do you think you're going?" "Let go of me," she said. Beverly ran. She burst through the service door and into the wet Seoul morning, her braids loose from their pins, shoes hitting the rain-slicked pavement in uneven rhythms. Her lungs were already burning. She did not look back. She never looked back. Looking back was how he caught you. A black car slowed at the curb beside her. She barely registered it until the rear door opened and a figure stepped directly into her path. She stopped. He was tall, perfectly pressed dark suit, not a single crease displaced by the rain falling around him. He did not look at the rain. He did not look at the street. His gaze went immediately to her face, to the swollen cheekbone, the bruise that had climbed toward her eye overnight, and it stayed there. "Who bruised your face?" He asked it quietly, the way a person states a fact they are already arranging the response to. Beverly opened her mouth. Her throat had closed. Her lungs were still on fire from running, and her mind was doing the rapid, practiced calculation she had spent 9 years perfecting. Threat level, exit options, what lie costs the least. She was standing in front of her employer on a public pavement at 7 in the morning, looking exactly like what she was, a woman who had been hit. A woman who had run in this direction because this was the only direction her feet still trusted. Tokko In-Su waited. He did not reach for her. He did not look around for witnesses or soften the question with reassurance or do any of the things people did when they wanted to appear concerned while keeping a careful, self-protecting distance from the actual situation. He stood in the rain with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on her face and gave her the full, unrushed weight of the question. She did not get to answer. "Beverly." Kyle's voice, close, too close. She felt the air shift behind her before she heard the footstep. Her whole body drew tight from the ground up, the involuntary, muscle-memorized preparation of someone who had learned to brace before the moment arrived, who had been bracing for so long she had stopped recognizing it as fear and simply called it readiness. Kyle stopped 4 feet back. He looked at In-Su with the unhurried, almost entertained assessment of a man who had never once encountered an obstacle he could not eventually move. He took in the suit, the car, the driver sitting motionless behind the wheel. He ran his private calculation quickly and quietly, and he arrived at his usual conclusion. "This is manageable." "She's with me," Kyle said. His voice was warm, reasonable, the voice he used when he wanted to be witnessed being reasonable. "We had a disagreement this morning, private situation." He glanced at Beverly, the look that carried its own complete language, every word of which she already knew, and then back at In-Su. "I appreciate your concern, but I've got it from here." In-Su turned toward Kyle. He did it the way a building turns, slowly, deliberately, with the full intention of putting himself between 2 things. He looked at Kyle's face, then his hands, then his face again. "No," In-Su said. Kyle's jaw shifted forward slightly. "Excuse me?" "She works for me," In-Su said. "She is already late. Her face was not like that yesterday." A short, disbelieving laugh left Kyle, the laugh of a man who has decided the person in front of him is operating with incomplete information about how the world actually works. "I don't know who you are, but this is none of your—" "I know who you are," In-Su said. The laugh stopped. In-Su took 1 step toward Kyle, 1 step. His hands went into his trouser pockets. His expression did not shift by a single degree. The delivery driver at the corner had gone completely still. The 2 women outside the cafe had stopped talking mid-sentence. The security guard at the lobby had turned his head without moving the rest of his body. "If you touch her again, you lose your hands." He said it the way a person states a weather forecast, matter of fact, pre-decided, entirely without theater. Kyle stood very still. Something moved behind his eyes, the specific, private signal of a man whose pride is loud and has always been loud, but underneath that noise, something older and more honest is transmitting a clear frequency upward that the pride cannot fully override. This man means exactly what he said, not as a figure of speech, not as posturing designed to dissolve once the stranger walked away, as a precise and literal description of what would happen. Kyle looked at Beverly one final time. She was looking at a point somewhere past In-Su's shoulder, not at Kyle, not at the ground. Past him, the way someone looks past a thing they have decided is already gone. Kyle straightened his jacket with both hands. One step back, then another. He turned and walked without looking back, and the sound of his footsteps thinned gradually into the noise of the morning until it dissolved into everything else and was gone. Beverly stood on the pavement and breathed. In-Su turned back to her. He looked at her cheek once, briefly, then at her eyes. "Can you walk?" "Yes," she said, steadier than she had any right to be. "Get in the car, I'll take you up." Before we continue, welcome. If you're new here, you've just found the story people have been talking about. I'm so glad you're here. If you've been here before, you already know. This is the one you don't skip. Subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what comes next, and drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching from, because this story is reaching places I never imagined, and I want to know exactly how far it's traveled. I read every single one. Every single one. Now, let's find out what Tokko In-Su discovers next and why it terrifies everyone. The interior of the car was the quietest place Beverly had been in a long time. Dark leather, the rain reduced to something distant and irrelevant the moment the door closed. In-Su sat on his side with a full, deliberate distance between them and looked out his window at the city moving past. Beverly sat with her bag on her lap and her hands folded over it, and her eyes on her own window. She pressed 2 fingers carefully to her cheekbone, and the pain flared, sharp and immediate, and she dropped her hand back to her bag. "Left panel," In-Su said, without looking away from his window. "There is a first aid kit." She found it, small, navy blue, sitting exactly where he said it would be. She snapped the ice pack inside and pressed it to her cheek and exhaled slowly through her nose. From the corner of her eye, she saw him glance at her once, then he looked back out his window. The building arrived. The driver pulled around to the private side entrance. In-Su stepped out and held the door. No ceremony in it, no performance of consideration, just the practical act of a man whose hand was already on the door and who held it because she was coming through it. She stepped out onto the forecourt with the ice pack against her cheek and her bag back on her shoulder. "Thank you," she said, "for what happened back there." He looked at her with the directness she was already learning was simply his default setting. "Does he know where you live?" "Yes," she said. He nodded once and turned toward the entrance. In the elevator, they stood side by side without speaking. Beverly watched the floor lumbers climb. She was aware of him beside her in a way that had no name yet, the steadiness of him, the way his breathing had no current underneath it, no warning signal embedded in the rhythm. She noticed this the way you noticed the absence of a sound you had been hearing so long you forgot it was there. The doors opened at 14. Sua was in the hallway, yellow pajamas with small rabbits printed across them, dark hair sticking up on the left side, both arms already extended before the elevator had fully opened, her whole small body leaning forward with the committed impatience of a child who had been waiting since the moment she woke up. "Penny!" Beverly stepped out and bent down, and the impact of the small body hit her with the full force of someone who had been waiting and was entirely done waiting. She pressed her face into Sua's hair and held on, and the child smelled like sleep and lavender soap and something underneath both of those things that was entirely and specifically her own particular warmth. "You are late," Sua announced into Beverly's shoulder. "I know, baby. I'm sorry." Sua leaned back and looked at Beverly's face with the direct and completely unself-conscious attention that small children have not yet been taught to disguise. Her dark eyes moved to the swollen cheek. Her brow drew together in a way that looked far too old for her face. "She have an owie," she said. "I bumped it, it's fine." Sua held the look for one more second, measuring, unconvinced, and then turned to her father who stood just behind Beverly. "Appa," the grave seriousness of someone filing an official report. "Penny has an owie on her face." "I see it," In-Su said, looking at his daughter. Something opened in his face that no other context in his life appeared to produce. Something completely unguarded, soft in a way his face was not soft in any other room. "Go get dressed. Mrs. Yoon made breakfast." Sua considered the offer, grabbed Beverly's hand, and said, "Come with me." "Let Penny put her bag down first," In-Su said. Sua released the hand with a sigh of profound theatrical suffering and disappeared down the hallway. Beverly went to the staff room near the kitchen, set her bag down, stood in front of the small mirror. The swelling had climbed toward her eye, deep purple at the center, yellowing at the outer edges. She applied arnica gel from her own bag, covered what she could, held her own gaze in the mirror for 3 full seconds, and went back out. In-Su was at the coffee machine. He set a cup on the counter near her side of the kitchen, without a word. Then he turned and looked at her with the same complete attention he had given her on the pavement. "Starting tomorrow, Sung-woo collects you at 7:15. She opened her mouth. 7:15, he said, in the same tone and with no additional explanation. She read his face. The conversation had concluded on his side before it began on hers. "Okay," she said. He picked up his own cup and moved toward his study. At the doorway, he stopped without turning around. "The ice pack, 20 minutes tonight." The door closed. Beverly stood in the kitchen with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup and felt something sit in her chest that she was not going to examine right now. Sua reappeared in a blue pinafore, hair in 2 uneven pigtails, holding out a hairbrush with the serene expectation of someone who had never once in her life been refused. "Fix it," she said. Beverly set her cup down. "Come here," she said. The treatment plan for Beverly's face was executed the following morning at the low table in the living room. Sua produced 4 drawings in careful sequence, placing each one in front of Beverly with the gravity of someone delivering a medical prescription. A yellow sun with a face that was smiling very hard. A house with a blue door and curtained windows. A figure with long braids that Sua identified as Penny, with a star above her head. A second figure with a dramatically large head and no visible neck, identified as Sua, also with a star, slightly larger. "This one is for making you feel better." Sua placed the sun drawing in front of Beverly with full seriousness. "This one is because everyone needs a nice house." "You are completely right," Beverly said with equal seriousness. Sua studied Beverly's cheek. "Does it still hurt?" "A little." "I will do another one," Sua said, pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward her. Beverly watched the small hands moving the crayon across the page. Without thinking, her fingers found the pendant at her throat and held it for a moment, the small automatic habit of a hand that always knew where it was, always needed to confirm it was still there. She released it and looked back at Sua's drawing. "This is us at the park," Sua said, holding up the newest one. 3 figures this time, the tall one without a neck, the one with the long braids, and the small one with the disproportionately large head, all 3 with stars above them, all 3 in the same frame. "Can we go this weekend?" Appa said maybe. "Maybe means yes if I ask the right number of times," Sua said with a considered skepticism of a child who had taken careful empirical notes on this subject. "Let us try once first, very nicely." Sua accepted this and went back to her drawing. Beverly looked at the 3 figures on the page for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she looked away. It was In-Su who noticed the necklace. Not the first time, he had seen it before, the thin gold chain, the small pendant resting at her collarbone. But on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into the routine, something changed in the way he looked at it. Beverly was at the kitchen counter cutting fruit for Sua's breakfast. In-Su came in and moved to the coffee machine. Normal, he did this every morning at this time. But this morning, he did not take his cup to his study. He stood at the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the city below. and Beverly continued cutting the fruit, and the kitchen held the two of them in the ordinary morning quiet. Then he said, without turning around, "Sua was asking me something last night." Beverly's knife continued moving. What was she asking? "About your necklace." He said it evenly. "She wanted to know why you wear it every day." Beverly's knife slowed by half a second. She kept her eyes on the cutting board. "What did you tell her?" "I told her some things matter enough to keep close." He turned then. He leaned back against the counter with his coffee cup in both hands and looked at her across the kitchen. His eyes went to the pendant openly, directly, without pretending he was looking at something else. "What is it?" "A crescent," Beverly said. She looked down at it briefly. "I bought it at a market years ago, Cape Town." "Which market?" She looked up at him. His face was composed and still and completely unreadable. "One of the outdoor ones," she said, "near the waterfront. I don't remember exactly which one." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once and picked up his coffee and walked to his study. The door closed. Beverly stood at the cutting board with the knife in her hand and did not move for 3 full seconds. She turned the pendant over with her free hand and looked at the back of it. The engraving was small and precise and impossible to read unless you were very close, or you already knew it was there. She put the pendant back against her collarbone and went back to cutting the fruit. In his study, In-Su sat at his desk and placed his coffee to the side and did not open a single document. He sat very still and looked at the wall. He had commissioned a necklace once, a long time ago, a jeweler in Insadong, a man who worked only on private commissions, who had taken the sketch from In-Su's own hand and studied it for a long time before he said yes. The crescent shape had been specific, the curve of it, the angle, the weight of the pendant. The engraving on the back had been 2 letters intertwined, cut into the gold with a tool smaller than a pen under a magnifying glass, while In-Su watched. He sat at his desk and thought about all of this very carefully. Then he picked up his phone and sent Sung-woo a message. "I need the name of the jeweler in Insadong who does private commissions, the one I used 11 years ago. Find him." He set the phone down and picked up the documents in front of him and made himself read. Sung-woo was in the forecourt the next morning at exactly 7:15. Broad, solid, mid-40s, the careful eyes of someone who had spent a professional lifetime watching the world without being watched back. He nodded once when Beverly came out and opened the rear door of the car, and he said nothing further. She appreciated the complete absence of conversation. That evening, Kyle was outside her building when Sung-woo pulled up. He stood against the wall beside the entrance with his arms crossed and his face composed into the reasonable expression, the one that said he was the patient one, the understanding one, the one who only wanted to talk. The expression Beverly knew preceded the other one, the way a low sky preceded rain. Sung-woo parked at a deliberate angle. He stepped out first. He positioned his body between Beverly and the building entrance with the smooth economy of someone who had done this kind of thing before and found it entirely unremarkable. He looked at Kyle. Kyle looked from Sung-woo to Beverly, who had stepped out with her key already between her fingers. "I only want to talk," Kyle said. "Not tonight," Beverly said. "Penny." "Not tonight," Sung-woo said. Kyle's eyes moved over Sung-woo with the measuring look of a man deciding the cost-benefit analysis of a physical barrier. Whatever he read in Sung-woo's particular stillness resolved the calculation quickly. "Fine," Kyle said, looking at Beverly. "Tomorrow." "You will not come here tomorrow," Sung-woo said, "or the day after." "Who exactly are you?" "Someone who will be here every day," Sung-woo said. Kyle stood there for a long moment with his jaw working. Then he pushed off the wall and walked away and turned the corner at the end of the street and was gone. Beverly let out the breath that had been sitting in her chest since Sung-woo stopped the car. "Go inside," Sung-woo said. "Lock the top bolt." She went inside and locked both bolts and sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet and looked at the wall. She placed her necklace on the nightstand the way she did every night, carefully, so the pendant rested flat. The gold caught the light from the window and held it. She had worn that necklace every single day for 9 years, through 3 surgeries and 14 months of recovery in a Cape Town private clinic, through the construction of an entirely new identity, Penelope Domini, assembled document by document, reference by reference, with the help of 2 people who had asked her nothing beyond what they needed to know to help her disappear properly. The necklace had been the one thing she woke up holding in that hospital, her hand wrapped around the chain while bandages covered everything else. And it had been the one thing in those first terrible, confused days that told her she was still there, still underneath all the damage, the same person she had been before. She lay back and stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep came. 3 weeks into the routine, on a Tuesday evening, Kyle did not come to the building. He was smarter than that now. He came instead to the small convenience store 2 streets away where Beverly had stopped on her lunch break to buy Sua a particular juice the child had decided was the only acceptable juice. Sung-woo was in the car outside. Kyle appeared at her shoulder in the narrow aisle between the refrigerators. "I have you blocked," he said, his voice low, eyes on the refrigerator in front of them, as though they were 2 strangers studying the same drink selection. "Yes," Beverly said. "That's a childish way to handle things." He moved with her as she turned toward the counter. "You embarrassed me in front of whoever that man is. You let him speak to me like that." A pause. "I need you to understand what that cost me." "I need you to leave me alone," she said. His hand closed around her wrist, not violently, that was never how it started, just firm, just the grip of a man communicating that she was not going anywhere until he decided she was. The convenience store attendant behind the counter was looking at his son. Then the door opened and Sung-woo walked in. Kyle released her wrist before Sung-woo was close enough to see the grip. He stepped back. He smiled. "Think carefully," he said quietly to Beverly, and walked out. Beverly stood at the counter with her wrist against her stomach. Sung-woo stopped beside her. He looked at her wrist. He looked at the door Kyle had just walked through.
"He touched you?" "My wrist," she said. "He grabbed my wrist." Sung-woo took out his phone. "Mr. In-Su will want to know," he said. She did not argue. She paid for the juice and went back to the car. That evening, after Sua was asleep and Beverly had gone home, In-Su got into his car. He had Kyle's workplace address from the background files Sung-woo had compiled weeks ago. He had known for 5 weeks that Kyle worked at a mid-sized import logistics firm. He had known for 4 weeks that the firm's parent company was a subsidiary of a holding group. He had known for 3 weeks that he owned 38% of that holding group and held 2 board seats. He had not used this information until tonight. He arrived at the building at 8:15. Kyle was still at his desk on the 6th floor when the receptionist, called ahead by someone from In-Su's office, showed him to the small conference room near the elevator bank. Kyle walked in expecting a client meeting. He walked in and saw In-Su sitting at the head of the conference table with a single folder in front of him and his hands folded on top of it, and the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he was always going to arrive and is simply allowing the other person to catch up to this fact. Kyle stopped. He looked at In-Su. He looked at the room. He looked at the receptionist, who closed the door quietly from the outside. Kyle sat down slowly at the opposite end of the table. "You know who I am," In-Su said. It was not a question. "You're the man from the pavement," Kyle said carefully. "I am Tokko In-Su." He opened the folder and turned it so Kyle could read the top document. "I own 38% of Dasong Holdings. Dasong Holdings owns Meridian Logistics Group. Meridian Logistics Group is the parent company of the firm you have been employed by for the past 2 years. Kyle looked at the document, then at In-Su's face, then back at the document. The color did not drain from Kyle's face all at once. It went slowly, starting at the edges, the way something expensive breaks in stages, each one worse than the last. Every salary deposit you have received for 2 years, In-Su said, in the same even tone he had used for every sentence, came from a payroll system that exists within my ownership structure. The contract you signed on your first day contains a standard conduct clause in Section 14, Paragraph 3. My legal team reviewed it this afternoon. He paused. You are in breach. Kyle said nothing. His jaw was very tight. Your access card will be deactivated at midnight tonight. A termination letter will be processed by HR tomorrow morning. You will not be eligible for a reference. In-Su closed the folder. You will also find that your work authorization renewal, which I understand is due in 6 weeks, has encountered a complication at the processing stage. Kyle looked at him. You can't. I already have, In-Su said. He stood up, he picked up the folder, he looked at Kyle one final time from the end of the conference table. She told you to leave her alone, he said. You put your hand on her wrist today anyway. A pause. 2 seconds. If you make contact with her again through any channel in any form, the legal file my team has prepared goes to the prosecutor's office. Medical records, photographs, a testimony from a previous partner who filed a protection order in Cape Town 3 years ago. Kyle's mouth opened. She deserves better than what you gave her, In-Su said, and you deserve exactly what is coming. He walked to the door, opened it, and left. Kyle sat alone in the conference room and looked at the closed door for a long time. He did not come back, not to the building, not to the convenience store, not to the street outside Beverly's apartment. He disappeared from her life with the completeness of a man who had run his own calculation and arrived at a result he could not argue with. Beverly noticed his absence the way you noticed when a sound you had stopped hearing had in fact been present all along, understanding only in its removal how much space it had been taking up. She did not ask what had happened. She looked at In-Su one morning across the kitchen counter, and he looked back at her, and she understood that the question had already been answered, and the answer was thorough and final. Thank you, she said quietly. He set her coffee on the counter in front of her. 7:15 tomorrow, Sung-woo will be outside. That was all. She picked up her coffee and went to find Sua. The files from Director Oh arrived on a Monday morning, 2 weeks after In-Su had made the call. He read them alone at his desk before anyone arrived in the apartment. He read the original accident report from the coastal road outside Busan, 3 pages compared to the 1-page official version on record. The 2 missing pages contained the witness statement of a driver who saw a second vehicle deliberately accelerate into the first car on a stretch of road with no cameras and no other witnesses. The witness statement was collected and then removed from the official record. The officer whose signature appeared on the original retired 6 months after the incident, on a pension significantly larger than his rank should have produced. He read the Cape Town hospital file, a private clinic in the southern suburbs, and patient admitted 9 days after the Busan accident date, unconscious on admission, no identification, arranged transport paid for by a third party whose name appeared once in the intake paperwork, a name In-Su did not recognize, but whose payment method, when traced by Director Oh's investigator, connected back through 2 shell accounts to a financial channel he recognized very well, a channel his mother had used for private arrangements for 20 years. The surgical notes covered 3 procedures across 14 months. The post-operative photographs showed a face that shared no visible features with the pre-operative photographs. The reconstruction was complete, done by someone very skilled, paid very well to do thorough work and ask no questions. He turned the page. The obstetric notes were attached separately, a single folded sheet clipped to the back of the surgical file, as though whoever had assembled the package had debated whether to include it and decided at the last moment that it was necessary. She was 14 weeks pregnant at the time of the accident. He set the page down. He picked it up again. 14 weeks. The pregnancy was not visible. He had not known. She had not told him yet. The note from the attending physician stated that the patient had been stabilized and the pregnancy monitored throughout the recovery period. The delivery had taken place 7 months after admission, full term, healthy, a girl, 3.2 kilograms. The line below the delivery notes read, "Infant transferred to private transport arranged by third party on day 4 postpartum. Patient was under sedation for post-surgical procedure at time of transfer. Patient was not consulted." He read that line 3 times. Patient was not consulted. His mother or someone acting directly for his mother had been in Cape Town, monitoring, waiting, and when the baby came, when she was sedated and could not object, and could not fight, and could not even know what was happening in the room next door, someone walked into that clinic and taken his daughter and put her on a plane to Seoul. He had been sitting in his apartment 3 weeks after that day when Sung-woo knocked on his study door and told him there was a woman downstairs. A representative, she said, from a private intermediary. She had something that belonged to him. He went downstairs. There was a baby in a carrier on the lobby table. His mother had called him that evening. She had said, in the composed and measured tone she used for everything, that she had arranged for the child to be brought home.
That Nanny was gone, that the child was his and Seoul was where she belonged, that she had done what needed to be done because he was not in a state to do it himself. He had believed her. He had picked up his daughter and believed every word his mother said because he was grieving and the baby was real and warm and present and the grief needed somewhere to go. He sat at his desk now and looked at the delivery note. Patient was not consulted. She had woken up from surgery in that Cape Town clinic, and her daughter was already gone. She had survived a murder attempt and delivered a baby alone, with no identity and no documentation, and no one she knew in the room. And then she had woken up, and the baby was not there either. He closed the file. He placed both hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall, and breathed very carefully for a long time. Then he let the morning run normally. Sua at the elevator, breakfast, letters practice at the low table, a debate about whether clouds were made of water that had been ongoing since Tuesday and showed no signs of resolution. Beverly at the counter preparing lunch, her braids pinned up, the crescent pendant resting at her collarbone where it always rested, catching the light when she moved. In-Su stood in the doorway of his study and looked at her for a moment before she heard him. He looked at the pendant, then at her profile, then back at the pendant. Then he went back inside and closed the door, and sat down at his desk and picked up his phone and called the jeweler. The jeweler remembered him. Of course he remembered. Private commissions at that level did not come often, and they did not come forgettably. In-Su asked him 2 questions. The jeweler answered both. In-Su thanked him and ended the call and sat in the quiet of his study for a long time. The necklace Beverly wore every day, the one she had told him she bought at an outdoor market in Cape Town, had a crescent at the exact angle he had sketched himself 11 years ago, connected at the upper point, the only one of its kind that had ever been made. He picked up his phone again and called Director O. Then he got into his car. He had Kyle's workplace address from the background file Sung-woo had compiled weeks ago. He had known for 5 weeks that Kyle worked at a mid-sized import logistics firm. He had known for 4 weeks that the firm's parent company was a subsidiary of a holding group. He had known for 3 weeks that he owned 38% of that holding group and held 2 board seats. He had not used this information until tonight. He arrived at the building at 8:15. Kyle was still at his desk on the 6th floor when the receptionist, called ahead by someone from In-Su's office, showed him to the small conference room near the elevator bank. Kyle walked in, expecting a client meeting. He walked in and saw In-Su sitting at the head of the conference table with a single folder in front of him and his hands folded on top of it, and the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he was always going to arrive and is simply allowing the other person to catch up to this fact. Kyle stopped. He looked at In-Su. He looked at the room. He looked at the receptionist, who closed the door quietly from the outside. Kyle sat down slowly at the opposite end of the table. "You know who I am," In-Su said. It was not a question. Kyle said carefully,
"You're the man from the pavement. I am Tokko In-Su." He opened the folder and turned it so Kyle could read the top document. "I own 38% of Daesong Holdings. Daesong Holdings owns Meridian Logistics Group. Meridian Logistics Group is the parent company of the firm you have been employed by for the past 2 years." Kyle looked at the document, then at In-Su's face, then back at the document. The color did not drain from Kyle's face all at once. It went slowly, starting at the edges, the way something expensive breaks in stages, each one worse than the last. "Every salary deposit you have received for 2 years," In-Su said, in the same even tone he had used for every sentence, "came from a payroll system that exists within my ownership structure. The contract you signed on your first day contains a standard conduct clause in Section 14, Paragraph 3. My legal team reviewed it this afternoon." He paused. "You are in breach." Kyle said nothing. His jaw was very tight. "Your access card will be deactivated at midnight tonight. A termination letter will be processed by HR tomorrow morning. You will not be eligible for a reference." In-Su closed the folder. He placed both hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall and breathed very carefully for a long time. Then he let the morning run normally. Suwa at the elevator, breakfast, letters practice at the low table, a debate about whether clouds were made of water that had been ongoing since Tuesday and showed no signs of resolution. Beverly at the counter preparing lunch, her braids pinned up, the crescent pendant resting at her collarbone where it always rested, catching the light when she moved. In-Su stood in the doorway of his study and looked at her for a moment before she heard him. He looked at the pendant, then at her profile, then back at the pendant. Then he went back inside and closed the door, and sat down at his desk and picked up his phone and called the jeweler. The jeweler remembered him. Of course he remembered. Private commissions at that level did not come often, and they did not come forgettably. In-Su asked him 2 questions. The jeweler answered both. In-Su thanked him and ended the call and sat in the quiet of his study for a long time. The necklace Beverly wore every day, the one she had told him she bought at an outdoor market in Cape Town, had a crescent at the exact angle he had sketched himself 11 years ago, connected at the upper point, the only one of its kind that had ever been made. He picked up his phone again and called Director O. Then he got into his car. He had Kyle's workplace address from the background file Sung-woo had compiled weeks ago. He had known for 5 weeks that Kyle worked at a mid-sized import logistics firm. He had known for 4 weeks that the firm's parent company was a subsidiary of a holding group. He had known for 3 weeks that he owned 38% of that holding group and held 2 board seats. He had not used this information until tonight. He arrived at the building at 8:15. Kyle was still at his desk on the 6th floor when the receptionist, called ahead by someone from In-Su's office, showed him to the small conference room near the elevator bank. Kyle walked in, expecting a client meeting. He walked in and saw In-Su sitting at the head of the conference table with a single folder in front of him and his hands folded on top of it, and the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he was always going to arrive and is simply allowing the other person to catch up to this fact. Kyle stopped. He looked at In-Su. He looked at the room. He looked at the receptionist, who closed the door quietly from the outside. Kyle sat down slowly at the opposite end of the table. "You know who I am," In-Su said. It was not a question. Kyle said carefully, "You're the man from the pavement. I am Tokko In-Su." He opened the folder and turned it so Kyle could read the top document. "I own 38% of Daesong Holdings. Daesong Holdings owns Meridian Logistics Group. Meridian Logistics Group is the parent company of the firm you have been employed by for the past 2 years. Kyle looked at the document, then at In-Su's face, then back at the document. The color did not drain from Kyle's face all at once. It went slowly, starting at the edges, the way something expensive breaks in stages, each one worse than the last. Every salary deposit you have received for 2 years, In-Su said, in the same even tone he had used for every sentence, came from a payroll system that exists within my ownership structure. The contract you signed on your first day contains a standard conduct clause in Section 14, Paragraph 3. My legal team reviewed it this afternoon. He paused. You are in breach. Kyle said nothing. His jaw was very tight. Your access card will be deactivated at midnight tonight. A termination letter will be processed by HR tomorrow morning. You will not be eligible for a reference. In-Su closed the folder. He placed both hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall and breathed very carefully for a long time. Then he let the morning run normally. Sua at the elevator, breakfast, letters practice at the low table, a debate about whether clouds were made of water that had been ongoing since Tuesday and showed no signs of resolution. Beverly at the counter preparing lunch, her braids pinned up, the crescent pendant resting at her collarbone where it always rested, catching the light when she moved. In-Su stood in the doorway of his study and looked at her for a moment before she heard him. He looked at the pendant, then at her profile, then back at the pendant. Then he went back inside and closed the door, and sat down at his desk and picked up his phone and called the jeweler. The jeweler remembered him. Of course he remembered. Private commissions at that level did not come often, and they did not come forgettably. In-Su asked him 2 questions. The jeweler answered both. In-Su thanked him and ended the call and sat in the quiet of his study for a long time. The rain came 3 days after In-Su received the files from Director O.
She looked at him. In the dim light of Sua's room, with the rain coming down outside and the child sleeping between them, and everything that had been sitting in the air of the apartment since the files arrived, since the jeweler's call, since the pendant, since all of it, the word landed differently than it would have 4 months ago. She nodded. She checked Sua one more time, cool enough, breathing evenly, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, and then she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands. In-Su came in 10 minutes later. He sat at the counter. She made 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of him and sat on the other side. They held their cups and the rain drove against the windows, and the apartment was warm and completely quiet except for the sound of it. He looked at her across the counter. She looked at her cup. I spoke to the jeweler, he said. She looked up. He remembered the commission. In-Su held his cup in both hands. The crescent shape, the angle, the chain connected at the upper point rather than the lower, which was unusual, the engraving on the back, 2 letters cut by hand. He looked at her directly. He confirmed there was only one made, that I was very specific about that. He set his cup down. I also received files this morning from Director O, a full accident report from the coastal road outside Busan, 9 years ago, October. He paused. And a hospital file from a private clinic in Cape Town. The kitchen was very quiet. Beverly looked at his face, then at the pendant resting at her collarbone, then at her hands, flat on the counter surface. The obstetric notes were attached, he said. His voice had not changed. It was the same measured, even tone he used for everything, and the steadiness of it was the most precise and the most careful thing in the room. She was 14 weeks. I didn't know. He looked at the counter. She hadn't told me yet. Beverly's hands did not move. The delivery record said the infant was transferred on day 4, he said, while the patient was under sedation, that the patient was not consulted. He looked up at her. I need you to tell me the truth. Not the market in Cape Town, the truth. The rain pressed hard against the glass. The city outside had disappeared entirely behind water. Sua's room was quiet down the hallway. The apartment held the 2 of them and everything that 9 years had accumulated between them, and the kitchen light was steady, and the tea was going cold, and there was no version of this moment that had any room left in it for anything other than what it was. Beverly looked at him for a long time. Nalia, she said. Her name, her real name, the one she had not said aloud in 9 years. In-Su closed his eyes. When he opened them, she was still there, right in front of him. The pendant was still at her collarbone. The rain was still coming down. Sua was asleep down the hallway, and 9 years were sitting in the kitchen with both of them. She told him everything. The car that came from behind on the coastal road, not drifting, not losing control, but accelerating deliberately into the driver's side on a wet road, with no barriers on the ocean edge. The impact, the barrier giving way, the fall and the dark water coming in through the broken window, very cold, very fast, and the darkness after that which lasted a long time. Waking up in Cape Town with her face wrapped in bandages, her hands wrapped in bandages, and in one hand she must have held it through everything, through the water and the dark and the ambulance she did not remember, still wrapped around the chain of the necklace at her throat. A nurse she had never seen sitting beside the bed. The nurse told her she had been in a medically induced sleep for 6 days. She told her she was in South Africa. She told her that her transport and care had been arranged and paid for by a private party, and she did not have the name of that party. The surgeries, 3 of them. The surgeon was careful and specific. After the second, he told her honestly that when the reconstruction was complete, no one who had known her face before would recognize her. She had lain in the recovery room and stared at the ceiling and understood what that meant. Whoever had arranged the accident had arranged it to be final. The fact that she was alive was not part of their plan. The new face was her only advantage, the one thing they had not anticipated. She told him about building Penelope Domini from nothing. Documentation and work history and references constructed piece by piece with the help of 2 people who had owed her a debt from before, who asked no questions and expected nothing in return except that she stay safe, and stayed disappeared. She told him she came back to Seoul, 3 years of watching from a distance first, learning the shape of Sua's life, the school she attended, the park she visited on Saturdays, finding the agency, arranging the interview, walking into this apartment for the first time and seeing her daughter, and not being allowed to show anything on her face that was not professional warmth and competence. She told him she had not known walking in that first day whether the grief Sung-woo had once mentioned, just once, quietly, in passing, was real or performed. She had not known whether In-Su had been part of what his mother had done. She had needed to watch him. She had needed 8 months of watching him with his daughter and with his people and in the quiet of those evening conversations before she was certain enough. When she finished, she was still sitting with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes on his face. He had turned toward the window at some point, and she had kept talking to his back, to the tension across his shoulders, to the city drowned in rain beyond the glass. He did not speak for a long time. "She told me you were dead," he said. His voice was completely level. The levelness was more precise and more controlled than anything loud would have been. "I know," Beverly said. "I grieved you for years. I know." He turned around. He looked at her across the counter with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the controlled public face, not the soft private face he wore for Sua. Something completely stripped of management. Something that had been under everything else for 9 years and had just come to the surface because there was no longer a reason to hold it down. He came around the counter. She did not move back. He stopped in front of her, close, closer than he had stood to her in 8 months of shared space, and his hand came up slowly, 2 fingers, gentle, lifting the pendant slightly from her collarbone and turning it over. His thumb moved across the engraving once. He looked up at her face. "I have been falling in love with you for months, while I believed I was somehow betraying someone I had lost." His voice was low and completely even. "Then I understood they were the same person, that there was never any betrayal, that it was always you." She looked at his face, at the scar on his wrist she had noticed on the 3rd evening and never asked about, at the line of his jaw and the particular quality of his eyes when he was not managing what they showed. at the man she had watched for 8 months from a careful distance, and had been falling toward for longer than 8 months, longer than 9 years, falling toward him before the accident, and during it, and after it, and across every mile and every surgery she had assembled to become someone else. "Junho," she said. He leaned forward. His forehead came to rest against hers. They stayed like that for a moment, his forehead against hers, and the pendant between them, and the rain coming down outside, and everything else suspended. "Can I?" he said. "Yes," she said, before he needed to finish. He kissed her slowly, the way a person moves towards something they have been afraid to want and have finally stopped being afraid. His hands came up to her face, careful, so careful, cupping her jaw as though she was something that had survived a great deal and deserved to be handled with the full knowledge of that. She put both hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palms, steady, almost steady, the effort of it visible in the almost. She leaned into him. He held her.
The rain drove against the windows of the 14th floor, and the city below was all water, and the kitchen was warm, and the kiss lasted as long as it needed to last, which was long. He pulled back. He looked at her face in the kitchen light. Then he stepped back and looked at her standing at the counter and said, "Rest." His voice had changed quality. Not much. Enough. She stood at the guest room door and looked at him standing in the hallway. "Good night, Junho." "Good night, Nality," he said. Her name, her real name, in his voice, the way he had always said it, the specific sound of it that no one else had ever produced. It sat in the center of her chest and radiated warmth outward in every direction. She closed the door. He drove to Hanam-dong alone the next afternoon. He did not call ahead. He arrived at the house at 2 o'clock and walked through the front door without ringing, and found his mother in the formal receiving room, the room with the high-backed chairs and the correct lighting that she had always used for conversations she intended to control. She was sitting with tea and a document she set aside when he came in, composed and unsurprised, the expression of a woman who had been expecting this visit and had prepared for it. He sat down across from her and placed the folder from Director O on the table between them. "Read it," he said. She did not touch the folder immediately. "Read it," he said again in the same tone. She looked at him. Then she opened it and read slowly, the accident report first, then the hospital file, then the obstetric notes, then the delivery transfer record with its single line at the bottom. Patient was not consulted. She read that line and did not react, and closed the folder, and placed her hands in her lap and looked at him with the composed expression of a woman whose face had been trained across 40 years not to betray her. "Everything I did," she said, "I did for this family." He looked at her across the table for a long moment. "You tried to kill her," he said. "You paid someone to run her off a coastal road on a wet night with no barriers on the ocean side. You arranged for her to be transported unconscious to another country and rebuilt surgically so that if she survived, which you did not plan for, she could not come back to the life she had. You watched her deliver your grandchild alone in a foreign clinic with no one she knew in the room. You waited until she was sedated and sent someone to take the baby. You brought the baby to Seoul and handed her to me and stood in front of me and told me her mother was dead." He held her gaze. "And then you watched me raise that child for 4 years, knowing that her mother was alive and had woken up in that clinic and found her gone." His mother said nothing. "She spent 3 years watching from a distance. She could not come back as herself because you made certain there was no self to come back as. She arranged a job interview. She walked into my apartment and saw her daughter for the first time in 4 years and was not allowed to show a single thing on her face because she did not yet know whether I was part of what you had done." He stopped. "Sua reached for her hand on the first day. Did you know that? Your granddaughter found her mother by instinct in a room full of strangers because some part of a 4-year-old child knew what your arrangements could not erase." His mother's composure held. It had always held. It was the one thing she had that nothing had ever broken. "She was not suitable," Madame Seo said. Everything I did was calculated to protect what this family has built. You would have thrown all of it away for a woman who— I am going to stop you there, he said. His voice had not changed, it had not risen, it had not sharpened. It was the same even tone he had used for every sentence in this room, and that was more precise and more final than anything loud would have been. The criminal submission was filed this morning, he said. Before I drove here, an independent firm, one that does not work for me and cannot be influenced by anything you have access to, filed attempted murder and criminal conspiracy charges with the prosecutor's office at 9:15. The documentation is complete. The obstetric notes are included. The delivery transfer record is included. The payment trail connecting your financial channel to the clinic transport is included. The witness statement from the coastal road that was removed from the official accident report is included. His mother looked at him. The prosecutor's office will move slowly. Your legal team is expensive and cases like this take time, but they will move. And while they move, this is what is already in effect as of this morning. He opened the second folder, thinner, domestic. You have been removed from every position you hold in the family's business operations, every account, every contact, every board seat, every operational element. As of 9 this morning, you have no access to any of it. The legal transfer documentation has been witnessed and filed. She looked at the folder. For the first time, her composure showed something at the edges. Not fear, not remorse, the specific expression of a woman who has just understood the full dimensions of what is being taken from her. The Hanam property will be monitored, he said. A security detail is being placed there today. They are not there for your protection. They are there to enforce the conditions. You will not leave the property without notification. You will not contact Nality. You will not contact anyone in my household. You will not contact Sua. You will not contact anyone in the organization. He paused. If you violate any condition, the prosecutor's office will be notified immediately, and your legal team will no longer have the option of a negotiated outcome. You are taking everything, she said. Her voice was still composed, but underneath it something had shifted, the voice of a woman who has built her entire life around a single currency and is watching it disappear. She woke up in a clinic in Cape Town with no face and no name, and no baby, and no way home. You took everything from her first. He stood. He straightened his jacket and picked up both folders. I will not be coming here again, he said. Sua will not be coming here. When she is old enough to make her own decision about whether she wants a relationship with you, she will make it herself. But she will make it knowing the full truth of what you did. I will make certain of that. He looked at his mother one final time across the formal room, the high-backed chairs, the correct lighting, the room she had always used to control the conversations that mattered. I spent 9 years grieving a woman who was alive. Sua spent 4 years without her mother because you decided your preferences mattered more than her life. There is no version of what you did that this family recovers from. There is only what comes after it. He left. He drove back across the river. Sung-woo in the front seat said nothing. He had known In-Su for 11 years. He drove. They were married on a Saturday in early spring. 30 people in a private garden outside the city. People who knew the real story, not the household version, not the public version, but the complete version, with all of its damage and its distance, and the stubborn, improbable insistence of 2 people on finding their way back to the same place. Sua wore a white dress with a yellow satin ribbon and carried a small wicker basket filled with flower petals, which she distributed along the garden path with extreme precision, pausing twice to redistribute where she felt the coverage was inadequate. She approached this responsibility with the focused seriousness of someone who had been waiting her entire life to do exactly this, and she was not going to let the occasion be undermined by uneven petal placement. The garden smelled like early blossoms and the turned earth of spring, and the light that morning was the particular pale gold of a season just beginning. Nality came down the path. She wore something simple, ivory, and at her throat the crescent pendant rested on its thin chain, where it had always rested, where it had rested through everything, through the water and the dark and the surgeries and the years, and every mile of the long road back to this garden, to this path, to this morning.
Junho watched her walk toward him. He stood at the end of the path with his hands at his sides and his face entirely, completely unmanaged. No professional distance, no controlled expression, none of the careful architecture that ran his face in every other context. Just the face of a man watching a woman walk toward him who had survived everything the world had put between them and had come back. She reached him. She looked up at him. He looked at her. "Malady," he said, quietly, just for her. Her name, given back to her with everything it had ever contained. Nearby, Sua, having completed the petal distribution to her satisfaction, had begun a whispered and apparently urgent discussion with the small daughter of one of the guests about the superior design of her dress. Junho heard it. He kept his face composed by considerable effort. Nality heard it and fixed her gaze on the middle distance with the focused expression of a woman who has made a specific decision and is committed to it. The officiant spoke. They said their words to each other. They meant every word. Every single word was true. Sua, when the moment arrived that she understood was the important moment, went still and watched with the solemn attention of someone witnessing something she already knew the weight of, even if she could not yet name why she knew it. Her basket was empty. Her yellow ribbon had come slightly loose. She watched her mother and her father with dark eyes that were entirely, unmistakably her own, and she did not look away. Junho took Nality's hand. The garden was very quiet for a moment, and then it was not, and the morning opened around them and everything that had been waiting finally arrived. 18 months later, Sua sat cross-legged on the living room floor and studied the face of her new sibling with the careful attention of a senior researcher encountering new data. The baby was 14 days old, he had a full head of dark hair, and the permanent expression of someone who found his current circumstances mildly beneath his expectations. He was in the padded seat on the coffee table, and Sua was 8 inches from his face, examining him. "He does not do very much," she said. "He will," Nality said from the sofa. She was sitting with her feet tucked under her and her tea on the armrest, watching her daughter examine her son with the expression of a woman who is completely and exactly where she is supposed to be in the world. "When?" asked Sua. "A few months," said Junho from the armchair. He was watching both his children and his wife. The expression on his face was the one that only this room ever produced in him. No management, no architecture, nothing held back. Every year of what had been survived to get here was visible in it, and every day of what they had built since, and the complete, settled, absolute knowledge of a man who knows exactly what he has and what it cost, and does not look away from either of those truths. Nality looked at him from the sofa. He looked back at her. Sua said, "I have been thinking about his name." "We gave him a name," Junho said. "I have a better idea," Sua said. "What is it?" asked Nality. Sua considered this carefully. "I will tell you tomorrow," she said, "when I have finished thinking." Junho looked at Nality. Nality looked at Junho. They said nothing because they had been parents long enough to know exactly where this conversation led if you engaged with it at 8 o'clock in the evening. Later, after Sua was asleep and the baby was sleeping, and the apartment had settled into its night quiet, Nality started laughing, sitting on the sofa with her tea, quietly at first and then fully, her head tilting back. Junho sat beside her and watched her laugh, and his face did the thing it did in this room, the complete and unguarded thing, and then he pulled her close.
She leaned into him with her shoulder against his chest and her laughter quieting into something warm and steady. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, and they sat like that while Seoul moved outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, lit up in the dark, the Han River visible in the distance where it had always been. The necklace was on the nightstand in the next room. 11 years, 3 surgeries, 2 names, 1 child who had reached for both their hands at the same moment at a fountain in a park on a mild autumn morning and pulled them forward without knowing what she was doing, only that it was right, only that this was where they all belonged. It had always been pointing here. Every single inch of it had always been pointing exactly here. And that is where we leave them. If this story moved you, if you stayed with it all the way to this moment, then you already know what I'm going to ask. Subscribe, because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is built to earn every moment it delivers. You do not want to miss what comes next. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Tell me which moment hit you hardest. Was it the pavement, when he stepped out of that car and 7 words made Kyle walk away? The pendant turning over in his fingers in the kitchen? The garden path in the spring light? Tell me. I read every single one, and I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.